We still call them poor. We still call their way of life poverty because the development planners and the international development agencies call it poverty because such persons and communities do not fit a Western-style high-consumption lifestyle. I dare say it is our high-consumption lifestyle that is underdevelopment rather than a subsistence way of life. Indeed, today the subsistence farmer is increasingly appreciated as someone who not only provides for her family, she does so using traditional environmental knowledge, what I call the real tech, or ethnoecology to contribute to the protection of Earth's ecosystems. Anthropologists have a term for such people. We call them cultures of habitat, or ecosystem peoples, because they're able to make a living without damaging the environment. And indeed, a lot of the research I do shows that humans sometimes are like beavers. We disturb the environment and create biodiversity. A good example of that would be the acequia farms of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado that I do a lot of work with, being an acequia farmer myself. The second type of poverty is the poverty of deprivation. And this is real poverty. When you're deprived of the land, water, and other usually communal resources that sustain your livelihood, you become poor. Deprived of their homelands and their traditional ecological practices, displaced peoples move into the cities where they are becoming a burden on what is rapidly becoming, as Mike Davis says, a planet of slums. While, as before, they may have been contributing to the protection of ecosystems and biodiversity. Now they are reduced to slum dwellers. The irony of this poverty of deprivation is that it is almost always the result of economic development policies imposed from the outside by Western nations or corporations. This brings me to another important concept that has become very critical ever since Paul Farmer first used it to describe the poverty of deprivation faced by Haitians. This is the concept of structural violence, and you need to make it part of your everyday thinking. The term, which was actually first used in the 1960s by Johann Galtung, denotes a form of violence which corresponds with the systematic ways in which a given social structure or social institution kills people slowly by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. Killing people slowly by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. That's structural violence. Institutionalized elitism, ethnocentrism, classism, racism, sexism, adultism, nationalism, heterosexism, and ageism are just some examples of structural violence. Lifespans are reduced when people are socially dominated, politically oppressed, or economically exploited. It really is that simple. Structural violence and direct violence are also highly interdependent. Structural violence, like poverty as a form of structural violence, inevitably produces conflict and often direct violence, including family violence, interracial violence, hate crimes, terrorism, genocide, systematic rape of women, and war. Obviously, the poverty of deprivation is the most significant and pervasive form of this type of structural violence. Yet, workers in public health and environmental protection professions are largely unfamiliar with this concept, or do not have the legal or institutional frameworks to address the structural violence of poverty in their own work. Why should public and environmental health professionals be concerned with structural violence? Because scientific studies demonstrate that the structural violence of poverty is the single most important compounding factor associated with negative health outcomes. Poverty, which is of course closely associated with a lack of access to healthcare and medicine, is the single most important compounding factor that increases the effects of toxic racism, of environmental racism. We cannot address public and environmental health disparities until we systematically address the problems associated with structural violence, and I realize that's a tall order. Poverty reduction is probably our most important strategy to promote long-term health improvements in our low-income and people of color communities. Yet, our professionals in public and environmental health are told that this is none of their business. This is not within your purview. It's not your responsibility. This is something that is supposed to be handled by the crumbling remnants of the welfare state, wherever those are. But no one is addressing this issue, and millions are falling between the cracks into what I would call a healthcare desert. You've heard of food deserts, places within South Los Angeles where you have to go 10 miles to find a fresh fruit or vegetable. Same thing with medical care. There are medical care or healthcare deserts. Entire areas of our country that are completely unserved or underserved by medical practitioners, nurses, or medical facilities. We need to map out the healthcare deserts of this country. I don't have to lecture you all about the origin of the current economic and financial crisis to make the case that there's a direct link between economic exploitation, environmental degradation, and poor public health outcomes. How environmental and public health care professionals link the struggle for better health care to the struggle to end the structural violence of poverty will be the pivotal turning point of this movement. But there are other issues related to structural violence that the environmental justice movement must recognize and address. One of these is the problem of historical trauma, a concept that was first developed and used by researchers studying the intergenerational health problems of Holocaust survivors and their families. More recently, Native American research scholars like my colleague and friend Karina Walters at University of Washington have conducted studies that focus on intergenerational trauma experienced by Native cultures and communities that have been subjected to centuries of violence under colonial domination and conquest. This approach defines historical trauma as, quote, the collective emotional and psychological injury both over the lifespan and across generations resulting from a cataclysmic history of genocide, end quote. Moreover, the effects of historical trauma include unsettled trauma, depression, high mortality, increase of alcohol and substance abuse, child abuse, and domestic violence. In this way, historical trauma is linked to structural violence and is a lot more pervasive than we have thus far acknowledged in the environmental health, environmental protection communities. Indeed, some of the research I've recently been conducting with a growing number of Mesoamerican or indigenous Mexican immigrant workers in the United States indicates that historical trauma associated with structural violence affects most of these diaspora populations. I want to point out, because I don't really see any faces and can't see very well with my glasses, but 10% of the agricultural workforce in California are Zapotecs. And yet we still keep behaving as if we're all mestizos. This is a form of internal racism. We don't really recognize how many indigenous peoples are in our community. And you go to LA, some of those traffic courts, the cops bring people in, they have a Spanish translator. That Zapotec doesn't speak Spanish or English. Right? So we need to begin to recognize a Mesoamerican indigenous diaspora is occurring involving millions of people who are leaving not because they don't love their homes, but because they've been driven out by the military, narcotráfico, and other forms of violence, including the use of death squads. In this research, I've interviewed dozens of indigenous women from all over Mexico, Oaxaca, Chiapas, Guerrero, other parts of Mexico, and Guatemala, for a study that I'm conducting on the role of Mesoamerican diaspora people in the food justice movement that includes a growing Latino population, participation in urban agriculture. I am finding huertos familiares, home kitchen gardens, from LA to Vancouver, British Columbia, by Zapotec, Maya, indigenous people who are the best farmers in the world from my point of view. Without exception, each of the women I interviewed related stories of violence and poverty stretching back generations. They directly experienced violence,